anymore. And I think it is really important to reaffirm that we are not going to be silenced or intimidated, but rather we are going to reaffirm our efforts to study these questions and to try to build a fairer and more equal world.
Thank you.
That's it. Let's talk about these questions and the methods we developed to attack them. Okay, so in particular, I want to talk about three things. First, I want to talk about our use of dashcam data to try and study inequality in policing. Then about using text data to try and predict target variables and characterize disparities. And finally, I'll talk about address data and using it to study migration and inequality in migration. Okay, let's talk about dashcam data. This is joint work led by Matt Franke and then with JD Zamparetsky-Pereira and Wendy Ju. We published it, in fact, a couple of months ago about detecting disparities in police deployments using dashcam data. Okay, so to start, what are police deployments? By police deployments, I just mean how many police are there in a given neighborhood at any given point. Okay, so how many police are there in different areas? Why do we care about these? Because intuitively, everything the police do flows downstream from where they are in the first place, right? So if the police officer is not in your neighborhood in the first place, they cannot stop you, search you, arrest you, use force against you, etc. So sort of all downstream measures of police activity flow from this basic question of where were the police in the first place. This also has consequences, by the way, for studying algorithms and measures of algorithmic bias. If there are disparities in police deployments, this can produce disparities in arrests. If you then train algorithms on arrest data, that may be biased by these disparities in police deployments. But even if you don't care about algorithms at all and just want to study inequality in policing, you care about where the police are in the first place. The police, however, do not necessarily want you to know that and have been quite reluctant to release even aggregated deployment data. And I should say, I'm quite sympathetic to the claim that the public does not have the right to know where every police officer goes at all times, right? That could be dangerous to the safety of the officers. It could undermine their ability to do their job. That's fine. What I'm less sympathetic to is the argument that we shouldn't know even aggregated measures of police deployment, like how many officers are deployed to a particular county or to a particular area, because that seems like the kind of thing that the public has a compelling interest in knowing, and after all, we're paying their salaries, without really seriously compromising police operations. But police have been quite reluctant to even release that aggregated sort of data. By the way, feel free to interrupt with questions throughout. Happy to. Okay, so we decided to do the natural thing and find the police. Specifically, we took data from 25 million public street scenes throughout New York City. So let me start by just telling you about the data set. I don't know how well you can see it on the screen, but basically this shows a representative image. In particular, our data comes from dashboard cameras on the front of rideshare drivers. So you've got like Lyft, Uber drivers, other rideshare drivers driving around the city, and some of them have cameras on their front dashboards. Why do they have these cameras? In part for insurance reasons. Like if you get into an accident, it's useful to have footage of the accident to prove like you're not at fault, stuff like this. And so people sell these drivers dash cams, and then those dash cams take pictures. And the data aggregators have access to this data. And this was the data that our collaborator Wendy Ju, who does a ton of work on driving, was able to get access to. So okay, so we've got like 25 million public street scenes throughout New York City. This sort of shows a picture of the spatial distribution throughout New York City. You can see that it's non-uniform, but we've got so much data that we have pretty good coverage of any given area. Okay, so that's the data set. I should say, by the way, that I think this, while these are public street scenes, so it's not like you can see anything that you couldn't see on the street. I do think this data has interesting privacy implications that are worth discussing, and I'd be happy to chat about them if they're of interest. But for my own part, there's a reason we're using this to try and keep an eye on the police as opposed to try and keep an eye on, protesters or, people sleeping on the street or other vulnerable populations, which I think would raise different privacy questions.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So is that Staten Island?
Yeah, perfect.
Staten Island?
Yes.
What is that blob halfway out towards Eastern Long Island? It's white and green.
Which
it doesn't fit the rest of the map.
Wait, the blob okay, so this may be embarrassing, but I'm going to admit my knowledge of New York geography is very bad for someone who lived there for 3 years.
That's
Wait, are we talking about this?
That marble spot, what happened to the dash cam data there?
Wait, you're saying down here?
No, just below them.
Oh, this thing here?
Yeah.
Oh, so this, I think, I should double check this for you, but I'm pretty sure it's JFK Airport is what that's capturing. Is that possible?
That's true.
Yeah. I think so. So you'll see over densities of the images around airports because you've got lots of dash cams loitering there.
It's much closer to, let's see.
Is that true? I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's JFK, but I could be wrong.
We can do it.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
a sense, you see in other cities that it's really populated airports.
Yeah, yeah. I am pretty sure this is. Yeah, I am pretty sure this is JFK, but I can double. Yeah, okay, it is. Yeah. And you see, yeah, and you see other over densities too. So like Central Park, right? You see over densities, and I think that's in part because of how the census block group boundaries are drawn. Okay, good questions. Other questions? Cool.
I guess you're gonna look at like the rate of appearance of police in some sense.
Spoiler.
I guess it's tricky to do rate with different sampling rates, which are also coming at different times of day and
Yeah,
for
we could.
different reasons.
Yeah, we'll talk
Okay.
about that a little bit. Yeah, good question. Good. Okay, fine. So this is the data. All right, so we're gonna train an AI model to detect police cars and dash cam images. And what we're gonna try and estimate is basically the probability that if you have an image, that image has a police car in it, and we're going to try and estimate disparities in this. For residents of different groups. So for example, Asian residents versus white residents versus Black residents. And in trying to do this, there are a couple biases we need to compensate for. So one is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the images are not from representative locations, right? So you can see that the distribution is non-uniform throughout the city. And so the way we do this is we are going to reweight the image distribution at the census area level to try and match the population distribution. So basically what this means is like if we're trying to estimate police exposures for Asian residents, we're going to upweight neighborhoods that have high numbers of Asian residents. A second thing is, we're going to train a computer vision model to try and detect police cars, but that model's not going to be perfect, right? It's going to have some false positive rate, some false negative rate. And so so sort of an intuitive version, for example, if for some reason our classifier was like really bad at detecting police cars in Asian neighborhoods, then we would tend to underestimate police presence in those neighborhoods. So to deal with this, we sort of explicitly test for disparities in how well the model performs across different areas, and we don't see evidence of that. And then we estimate, the model's false positive rate and false negative rate so that we can kind of compensate for that in our measures of police exposure. There are also some biases that we're not able to compensate for in this pipeline, and we'll return to this point at the end of the talk. Okay, so results. So first of all, does the model work? The model works quite well. Here are some sort of examples showing how, it draws purple boxes quite successfully around police cars. These are not cherry-picked examples. I'll show you the quantitative statistics in a bit, but this is just to give you an idea of what the model does. And so it works pretty well. Maybe I'll just show you the quantitative statistics now. So you can see the AUC, ranges from 0 to 1. It's like 0.99, it's quite good. The average precision is similarly quite high. So, the performance of the model is good. I think there's sort of two reasons the performance of the model is good. One is that Matt, the student leading this project, did a really nice job just collecting and annotating a lot of data and training a computer vision model on it. This, in subsequent projects, we did things zero shot, where you just ask the model, is there a police car visible in this image? At the point where we did this, the models weren't quite to the point where you could just do that. So we trained a supervised learning model, and he got a big data set, and we did a good job of training it. That's part of it. I think the other reason, though, is that the detection task, I think, is not that hard. The police cars are standardized, they're highly distinctive, they're just not that hard to detect in images. And I think this is one strength of this approach relative to, there's been prior work trying to detect surveillance cameras in images. That's a much harder thing to do, and the prediction performance is not nearly as good. Okay.
And the 0.99 seems really high. Is this normal? Is it balanced the data? Well, how is it set up here?
Well, it is in some sense high. I think
because the only thing higher than this is one, right?
Well, 0.995, there are a lot of numbers, but yes,
Right.
yeah. Yeah, but no, so what I would say is the AUC looks really good, but because this is such like the test set is incredibly imbalanced. So this is.
So it's imbalanced.
I'm not sure that this is run on an imbalanced set. I don't think our test set is that imbalanced, but what I would say is that that you need really, really good classification performance, or the conditional on being classified positive, it's probably going to be a false positive. In other words, this performance truly is good, but you need really, really good performance to not have hopelessly.
Oh, because police cars are rare.
Police cars are super rare. I don't quite remember, but it's like 0.5% of images have a police car. So like if you had an AUC of 0.8, almost all your positive detections would be fake.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's where I was wondering if
Yeah.
it's a balanced setup.
Yeah. Well, that's one reason-
you achieved here.
Well, that's one reason we also look at AUPRC, right? Because that's something which is going to be less sensitive to a highly imbalanced data set. And this is saying like our average precision continues to be really, really high. Yeah. So I think the basic answer to the question, I think the performance is actually very good. I don't think that, and I think the reason that is because like this is just, it's not that hard a prediction task, and we had quite a lot of data. Good. Other questions? Cool. Okay, so we have a classifier that works quite well. And then we feed it into our estimation pipeline. And while I described the estimation pipeline to you at a conceptual level and, the way it's trying to compensate for biases, I didn't describe it at the mathematical level. So feel free to ask other questions if you're curious. But this is basically the results. This map is the results of taking our detections and then feeding them through the pipeline that tries to, for example, reweight to compensate for representative image locations, and also compensate for imperfect classifier performance.
So not to give some technical, so like I have 1,000 pictures of this part of the city.
Yeah.
And I can say what percentage of those pictures seem like police cars.
Yeah.
But how do I go from that? You just that with the probability, like if you thought they were randomly taking photos across random locations within some zip code or something.
Yeah.
You say, okay, the probability is the number I estimated of how many pictures have those cars.
Uh,
But then it depends on the time of day and which streets in the neighborhood. And
Yeah, so we're not reweighting by time of day, although that would be an interesting thing to do. Rather what we do is reweight at the census area level. So there's sort of two ways that we go from the raw detections to the actual numbers. One is we compensate for false positive rate, false negative rate, to say not all detected positives are true positives. Okay, and that's just, you have an estimated FPR and an FNR, and it's a fairly straightforward algebra to do that. And then the other thing is we take the census areas and we reweight them to sort of match the population distribution.
if I were trying to get a count, I can see why it needs a population distribution.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I just say, like there were this many photos taken and 1% were police cars, so that's 1%
Yeah.
of the time.
I think the reason is that like,
Police car.
if I have like 10,000 pictures in Central Park, but like, as you know, perhaps I might, but like no one lives in Central Park, I might want to downweight it. I think this particularly becomes important if you're estimating subpopulation specific distributions, right? So if I want to know about the exposure for Asian residents, then I want to upweight.
Oh, you're trying to calculate like
Asian.
a citywide exposure of a given demographic.
Yeah,
by
then.
adding up across all the places.
Yes, but even for this plot, as I recall, we're doing to get, basically I'm showing you here disparities at the neighborhood level, and within each neighborhood, we're reweighting at this like sort of sub census area level to sort of basically make sure that like we are upweighting regions of the neighborhood that truly have a lot of people, because I think we care more about where the people are than where the images happen to be. I think that's the intuition for it. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Well, I could show, you could go lots of ways.
Yeah, I think so. But I think the separate thing is, you could reweight on the basis of other covariates like time of day. It's an interesting question. It might be worth doing. That wasn't what we did, but we do reweight at the area level. Yeah.
I have a question on, is there or rather should there be a difference between cars that are cars and cars that are driving? I mean, I might be wrong, but like deployment, is it
Yeah.
the rate that has to be there versus if they're driving based off of like a car?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so it's a good question. Yeah, I think that's a great question. At the time we did this project, we didn't have the granularity to be able to differentiate between those two. I think now you might be able to do that. Like with zero shot models, you might be able to say, is this car driving? Does it have its lights on? we didn't do that basically because police cars were rare enough that like by the time you filter to different subtypes of police cars, it would be like pretty hard to do that. But I think with subsequent generation of model, you could, and I think that'd be cool. Yeah, good question. Okay. Okay, spatial disparities. The basic point here being there's a lot of variation. From the highest neighborhood to the lowest neighborhood, I think it's like a factor of 20 difference. For those not familiar with New York, like that's Manhattan, this sort of reddish area, and then blue is everywhere else, which is probably a totally insufferable way to describe New York, but that is sort of the relevant variation here. And so, if you wanted to sort of summarize by neighborhood, right? New York sort of has 5, they're called boroughs, sort of sub areas, Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. And so summarizing this plot on the borough level, you see Manhattan has higher levels than the other boroughs. This on its own is like probably not that concerning, right? There's like a lot of reasons that Manhattan might have higher levels. There's a lot of commercial activity, there's a lot of tourism, there's been, terrorist activity there in the past. For many reasons, it wouldn't be surprising if you saw a lot of police cars in Manhattan. More concerning is when you break it down by race. Here we're sort of showing levels of police exposure in different residential neighborhoods, and you can see that Black and Hispanic residents face higher police department levels than white and Asian neighborhoods.
I'm just trying, I'm getting back to the waiting question, but so like if I were driving through a rural area, I would expect to see no police cars and no people. And if I was driving through like a super population dense area, I would see a lot of people and I would see a lot of police cars. Probably.
Yeah.
Manhattan is like much more population dense.
Yeah.
The other boroughs.
Yeah.
So is that net of population density? Or
No, this is not per capita. This is just literally saying like the odds that an image is showing a police car.
okay, because it could also be that, like the number of square foot per person in residential areas, it's higher and higher income communities, and you're gonna end up with, the kind of per person, depends what you think the right thing is, like, is there one on do you see a police car on my block, or do you see a police car per person on my block?
Totally. So I think I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of different ways you could say these numbers should be normalized. You could say they should be per capita. You could say they should be normalized for crime rate in some way. Let me be clear about the claim I'm making here. We're not trying to make the claim that this is like conclusive proof of like misallocation of police cars or of bias. That's not the claim we're making. Rather, the claim we're making here is there's some evidence of disparities here. This is potentially concerning, and residents of the city have a right to know about it. That's really the only thing we're trying to say. I think to actually say like this is a misallocation of police cars, you have to do a lot of further work. Like I don't think controlling per capita would be sufficient. You'd want to say like what are the crime rates and does that just
like total crimes in that area?
Yeah, maybe.
Crime rate, police cars per number of crimes.
Yes, you could potentially do something like that.
Of course, that gets into detection issues.
Yeah.
Which are also involved in some of the police cars.
Yeah, exactly right. And like, are they affected? Yeah. So I think, I think doing I think there is the separate question of how many cars should there be? We're simply saying there are disparities here, and we think that like the residents of New York have a right to know about them.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Yes.
I was really struck by Staten Island. I look at Staten Island and think Tony Soprano. There's plenty of crime in Staten Island. Having grown up there, and it is a place that you very carefully need to.
Okay.
I'm really surprised at the low level of police there. To me, that's another part of your story. Why there's such a disparity in region.
Like you would expect more police cars to be in Staten Island.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. It would, I can mention that to Matt as well, the student who mentioned this. But yeah, in fairness, we're not saying necessarily low absolute police levels. We're saying lower than these other areas in New York. Right. Yeah. No. Okay, but yeah, maybe another part of the story is maybe Staten Island is under policed. I don't know, yeah.
I think the first is just a quick follow-up to Brian. Isn't it, my recollection is that also police disproportionately live in Staten.
Is that true?
I think so.
That's interesting.
Someone about. My second question is, do you have a sense of what share of sort of police deployments in vehicles are in unmarked cars?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one of the caveats we'll return to at the end. And I
imagine that's also sort of unequally distributed, but if it's only a small percentage of cars,
right, then maybe
even if they were fully doing like, you can only sort of do inflation thing.
Right, it is like within this band, it has to be. Yeah. But yeah, by construction, we cannot detect unmarked vehicles, and clearly that's the limitation. Good questions. which,
No, not here, the next one, race, residential zone,
Mhm.
how do you measure race?
yeah, so what we're doing here is we're filtering for just residential zones. So each sort of area has like a thing attached to it saying whether or not it's residential. And then what we do is for example, for Black residents, we're upweighting neighborhoods proportional to their number of Black residents. Okay, so the analysis is confined to residential zones and the upweighting is determined by the population of that race group in that area as reported by the census.
So, let's say that there is a majority of residents in residential zone, then it becomes black.
We're not giving hard assignments to any residential zone. It's not deterministic. Rather, what we're saying, like, let's say there were like, in a given residential zone, there were 800 Black residents and like 100 white residents or something like this, then the upweighting would be proportional to the number of residents in that zone. So it's totally analogous to what we were doing before. It's just that we're filtering for residential zones here. And in particular, we're not trying to say like, if you live in this area, you are definitely Black or definitely white. We're just upweighting proportional to the population in that area.
When you say over policing or under policing, like policing is a strategic relevant, right?
Yeah.
So how do we know that it's over policing or under policing?
Yeah.
What's the baseline?
No, it's a good question. We're again, to be clear, we're not making the claim that this is proof of over policing and under policing. Rather, we're saying there are disparities here that citizens have a right to know about, and that might be of concern to them. We're certainly not trying to attack the question of, is this definitive proof of over policing? Because I don't think we have the evidence to make that claim.
Right. But I guess the question is, how do they interpret this disparity? Like, what do we learn out of this disparity?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think, for example, so for example, let's say, two neighborhoods, had access to this and like the policing levels are higher in neighborhood A than neighborhood B. And, the residents of neighborhood A and neighborhood B get together and be like, this seems backwards. Like neighborhood B is much more dangerous. Like they might, residents of that neighborhood might disagree with the rankings that are implied by police disparities. Like one thing you could do is just show this to people and say like, okay, is this commensurate with your expectations and with your wishes?
Mhm.
Maybe the way to think about like how neighborhood men use it. I know that a lot of people look at stop and frisk data also.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can how that like correlate or overlap, but some of the analysis there that made like, as you said, it's really hard to get it for somebody on body into issues, but like maybe like insight to cost is different if there's
Yeah.
something more.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think in some sense this is complementary to stop and frisk data, because with stop and frisk data, you can do stuff like, you're searching folks of different races. How often are those searches finding anything, right? So I've written a paper on this, my co-author Shard has written a paper on this. And so you can look at, for example, searches and the outcomes of those searches. And so it's a very different type of data than this sort of where are police in the first place. In some sense, it's downstream from that. So I think they are complementary to each other. It's also worth saying that like, analyses of those data sets have, provided, I think, quite strong evidence of bias against Black and Hispanic residents of New York City. And so in this sense, that's one of the reasons you might be concerned about these disparities. Yeah, good question. Okay, we also see evidence of socioeconomic disparities. So here again, we're filtering for residential zones in different income quartiles, and we see sort of higher police exposure levels in lower income areas. Okay. I do want to mention, so two important biases we cannot compensate for. So one is, as mentioned, sort of marked police vehicles are only partial proxy for all policing activity. It doesn't capture unmarked police vehicles, doesn't capture police officers on foot. We tried to train that model to do that. We couldn't find enough officers to do a good job with it. Someone asked when I gave this talk about officers on horseback. I guess that's also a problem. I'm not sure that's like a major issue, but I think another thing is like we reweight data at the census area level. But to the extent that images within each census area are non-representative, we're not going to be able to deal with that. So to give an example of this, like, well, for example, we have no pictures of police in the subway. Subway policing has been a question in New York City. Similarly, if there's some big protest and there's a ton of police around the protest, but the area is totally walled off, so we can't even get the enemy's car images there at all, then we're not going to be able to see the protest. Our images are going to be non-representative. We're not going to be able to reweight to deal with that. So those are two issues. Okay, so yeah.
Okay, just on that, as you were discussing this,
Can you train the model to know when the police car lights are on? Is that where communicating something criminal?
Yeah, so I think and this is related to the previous question. Yeah, so I think it's a great question. We don't do this in this analysis in part because we just wouldn't have the data to be able to train a model. Like police cars are too rare to support that. I think with the subsequent generation of models that can do sort of zero shot, you can just ask the model, does this car have its lights on? And I think you could do that, and I think it would be interesting. Good. Okay, so I think the main conclusion we draw from this is it's important for the police themselves to release better data. Like this is not a realistic way for ordinary citizens to exert oversight, right? It's like, you need specialized hardware, proprietary data, like annotated data sets, lots of that, etc. And at the end of this, you still have these caveats where, you're not estimating something which is as accurate as what the police have access to themselves. So I think while this analysis does provide evidence of concerning disparities, although certainly not, definitive proof of bias or over or under policing, the police themselves, I think, should just release aggregated deployment data because the residents of their city have a right to know about this. Yeah.
It's relatively hard to infer anything about under policing or over policing.
Totally.
So it's.
No, I agree. But is the claim really like, therefore they should not release any data at all because evidence is challenged?
All data should be released, but I'm just saying, even if they release the data to you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you will be able to draw any definitive claims about under policing or over policing.
I think it would be challenging to do. I don't think it would be impossible to do. I think, for example, one thing you could do is just ask residents of the city how they feel about the different policing levels. I think that would by itself be somewhat informative. You could look at the data over time and sort of say like, okay, how do police levels, correlate or not with reductions in crime or with presence of crime? I think the other reason this data would be useful, by the way, is for understanding potential biases in algorithms that make use of policing data. If some areas are more heavily policed, then crimes in those areas will be more likely to be reported. And that's an important thing to understand when you're training algorithms on whether crimes are detected at all. So I think I definitely agree with you. This is a very challenging problem. I'm not taking issue with that. I still think the data would be quite useful, but it sounds like you agree with that too. Other questions?
You did, I think for your analysis, Uber drivers took into account expected police presence for, they were deciding their route.
Oh, great question. Oh, I like that question. I think it would, well, so here's an extreme case. Let's say they always avoided the police, then we'd never see any police and this analysis wouldn't work at all. So like I think in the limiting cases, pretty much true. I think more broadly, again, to the extent that our images within each area are non-representative, we can't relate to deal with that, right? We can only relate based on sort of the set of covariates that you have access to, and if there's some sort of, non-representativeness based on unobservables, we're not going to be able to deal with them. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Relatable. I'm still confused about why when you're driving, they'll give you a notification that police are up ahead. That seems like not like the kind of thing you should be telling drivers, but like anyways, separate question. Okay. Other. Good. Okay. So yeah, I mean, this work got some attention from both from local news outlets and from public defenders who are concerned about disparities in policing. Oh yeah, that's another population, by the way, that I think might make use of this data if it were released. Defenders trying to sort of say, this is context that should be taken into account. Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is we've released 1/10 of this data set online, the images. And so if you're interested in sort of urban studies, I think this can be used for a bunch of other things. And so, you should download it, play around with it, so on and so forth. Also, if you're just interested in generic computer vision, this might be the kind of thing that would be useful. And then finally, there's a bunch of other stuff you can detect from images of public street scenes, and I certainly welcome suggestions in that regard. Matt and Wendy have done a bunch of great other work, trying to detect like scaffolding, scaffolds in New York that seem to be put up without registration. What we did in a follow-up paper is use it to detect flooding. Flooding in New York has been getting sort of increasingly severe of late. You get like heavy rains and, sort of scary, people, literally getting rescued from their apartments, stuff like this. And so it turns out that we can detect floods pretty accurately from these street scenes. And so that's what we did in the follow-up paper. And there, by that point, the vision language models had evolved to the point where we could do the zero shot you know, and just sort of ask it, does this scene show a lot of standing water? And we show that they work pretty well.
Can you do much of a time dimension to these? Like, what's the sort of frequency that you could get data from either the dash cam stuff or others to see like
Yeah.
evolution over multiple years or different times?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one benefit, this data is less worked with than Google Street View data. So Google Street View is like much lower temporal density. You might have several years between images, whereas here, for the flood data set, we have like 926,000 images from a single day. Like it's like very high temporal
Then like
density.
how many days, like is this over the course of some weeks or years?
I mean, the company has access to data over, you know, the course of years. Yes. And so, you know, in the policing data set, I think we study a 3-month period. I mean, it's sort of a question of like, what are we able to persuade the company to give us, basically? But yeah, you can study changes over time, definitely. Yeah, and I think in the flooding paper, it's possible we have a plot in the paper showing sort of over time, you know, when do the flooded images occur, and you show that they sort of appear when you'd expect them to, given the trajectory of the storm. Yeah. Good. Yeah, but I do think that's one nice, like, I think relative to Google Street View, what this data affords is its higher sort of spatial density and temporal density. And that's quite a nice thing. Yeah. Good. All right, let's talk about text data. Okay, so, you know, whatever, everyone's very excited about large language models. We are too, particularly as they intersect with the questions we're interested in. So I'm going to talk about 2 pieces of work. One is joint work with a ton of great co-authors in the New England Journal of Medicine AI recently, and then the other is just accepted at ICML. Okay, so first I want to start by talking about how large language models intersect with questions of equity. So there's been a ton of valuable discussion about how large language models can increase bias and inequity. Here's a sampling of these papers, you know, how they can be biased against various groups by race, gender, religion, etc. And this is really, really important work because these harms are well documented and these models are increasingly widely used. Less studied, though, are applications of large language models to improve equity. In particular, we spent Thanksgiving just like counting papers and coding. And in particular, among papers which focus on equity impacts, about 85% of them focus on equity harms and only 15% of them focus on opportunity. And we think, you know, while it is very important to document the harms, this sort of leaves an understudied opportunity to study how LLMs can create important new equity-related opportunities, because like a very important aspect of what is the impact of an AI system, an AI model, is what problems do we choose to apply it to in the first place. And so if we focus only on sort of the downstream, like how do we, you know, make it as fair as possible given a fixed use case, we're going to miss an important opportunity to sort of turn these models to equity promoting impacts. So that, you know, what we wanted to do in this paper was sort of highlight some sort of broad problem cases that were equity promoting. So what we did here was we pulled together a whole bunch of co-authors from, you know, both from computer science and sort of natural language processing, but also from healthcare and various other domains to try and lay out some use cases. And in particular, here are 3 we highlighted. The first was detecting human biases. So, you know, people have biases, those contribute to social inequities. And those biases are often documented by rich text data sets. So for example, you know, trial transcripts, clinical notes, police stop transcripts, what have you. And so, you know, people have used these data in the past to try to detect biases, but often using relatively rudimentary methods like keyword search methods. And so here, you know, LLMs offer us the ability to sort of more precisely detect subtle biases in sentiment or in tone or in stereotypes, and thereby sort of more accurately detect human biases. A second application, and I think this is something folks here are excited about as well, actually, is creating structured data sets from unstructured text. So structured data sets are things like, you know, it's anything that sort of you can express in a nice CSV with sort of standardized column formats, right? In contrast, text is unstructured. And structured data sets are very valuable for equity research, as they are for all research, right? So for example, you know, the Washington Post won a Pulitzer a couple of years ago for creating a structured data set of police shootings. That was actually, I think, featured in the New York Times even just a couple months ago. So people are still using that data set. But like creating that data set, which has standardized data, like, you know, the race of the victim and whether they were armed and, you know, where the stop occurred or where the shooting occurred, et cetera. required a ton of effort, right? It basically required a journalist to like go through local news stories and like extract each field painfully one bit at a time. And that's the kind of task that LLMs are just like very, very good at. And so we think that a powerful application is to just use them to support the work of journalists, activists, researchers who are trying to create these structured data sets from unstructured text. And then the final application is around improving equity of access to information. For example, improving equity of access to medical information, legal information, where, people might not have access to specialists in an equitable way. So we wrote this paper sort of laying out a broad research agenda that we hoped folks would work on. We also wanted to actually, not just tell other people to do work, but to hopefully do some useful work ourselves. And so specifically, we wanted to focus on a particular task that has powerful applications to detecting human biases, but also much more broadly. And specifically, we wanted to see, could we use large language models to identify interpretable text features which predict a target variable? I'll give you some examples of this in a second. This is work led by Raj Mova and with Kenny Pang, who really did just a terrific and extremely independent job leading this project. Okay, so what are examples of this? Like, why would this be a useful thing to do? Well, if we could do this, here's how we might use it to detect bias. We could say, what text features in a police stop transcript predict whether the officer is speaking to a white driver or to a black driver? Or what text features in a clinical note predict whether the note belongs to a male versus female patient or a black versus white patient? And these are not hypothetical tasks, by the way. People have done exactly these things in previous papers. But it's also like quite useful in the social and health sciences more broadly. Like, what features of a social media post predict whether it will go viral? What features of a restaurant review predict whether the restaurant will get a high rating? What features of a clinical note predict whether a patient will develop cancer? So this is like a broadly useful task. It's been described as hypothesis generation from text, trying to identify interpretable text features that predict some outcome. And because this is an important task, people have attacked it for a long time, starting with just sort of classical NLP methods. So like, one simple thing you might do, let's just use the running example of, I want to know what text features predict whether a headline will get a lot of clicks, okay? So one simple thing you could do is you could just like divide headlines into things that get a lot of clicks, things that don't get a lot of clicks. And you could say what words occur more often in the headlines that get a lot of clicks versus those that don't. And that's like sort of the essence of the fighting words method. So what people have done in these what I mean by classical methods are sort of things that precede the rise of LLMs. But it's possible that we can do better with these classical methods, right? Because large language models are very good at representing and analyzing text, and as such, should offer improved abilities to accomplish this task. So people have also used LLMs to try and do this. How might you do this? Well, one reasonable thing you might do is you might give the LLM some positive examples, some negative examples, and just ask it. Hypothesize differentiating features. Like you give it some headlines that get a lot of clicks, some headlines that don't, and you ask it what differentiates these, come up with some things. And, a paper has been written using exactly this approach. It's a very reasonable thing to do. The limitation is that it's not very scalable. You're not going to, if you have like 10 million headlines, you're not going to be able to feed 10 million headlines into your LLM due to both sort of context window limitations and also due to reasoning limitations. You're going to have to give it a subset of your data set. And that's going to undermine your statistical power and your ability to detect rare features and so on and so forth. It's also, by the way, going to be expensive, right? Because like if you have to like feed in a ton of text, it has to process a lot of tokens. And if it's not, if it's an API-based system, then it's going to be expensive to do. Okay. Another reasonable thing you might do is you might take an LLM, take a model, and fine-tune it to predict the target variable. In other words, to predict whether a headline is going to get a lot of clicks. And then, now that you have this model that does a good job of predicting it, try and interpret the neurons of that model. Problem with this is that neurons are not automatically interpretable. And this has been referred to as superposition. One neuron often encodes many concepts simultaneously. So you don't necessarily have a neuron that like captures like cute dog. Like the same neuron might capture like cute dog and like sushi and like philosophy, right? So like there's just no a priori reason that neurons have to be interpretable, and indeed empirically they are not. So the basic challenge that both of these works run into is that if you want to efficiently and scalably learn statistical relationships between text and outcome, we need numerical representations of that text, like neurons, but interpreting neurons is hard. So we proposed a new method called hypotheses. This name was controversial. By controversial, I mean, I like went to bed one night right before we submitted the paper and we had agreed on a name. We all agreed. And then I woke up the next day and one author was like, oh, my girlfriend thinks this name is better. And now we have this name. So now we're stuck with this name, which is fine. Hypotheses. And you know, okay, so I'm going to illustrate to you how we apply this method. And again, we're going to be running an empirical example of what features of the headline predict engagement. Okay. To motivate our approach, we start with the theoretical result that we derive, a triangle hypothesis inequality for hypothesis generation. Namely, if a neuron is predictive of a target variable, then a sufficiently high fidelity interpretation of that neuron will also be predictive. This motivates a three-step procedure, and I'll start by describing it to you at a high level, and then I'll tell you more about each of these steps. In the first step, feature generation, we're going to learn interpretable neurons. Then we're going to select the subset of those neurons that predict our target variable. And then finally, we're going to interpret those neurons. So we don't just have numbers, we actually have natural language explanations of the neurons. Okay, so the first step, feature generation. What we're going to do is we're going to start with text embeddings and we're going to train something called a sparse autoencoder. And then we're going to use the neurons of the sparse hidden layer in the autoencoder as interpretable features. So let me show you how this actually works. So here's our headline. I was surprised at the largest buyer of elections in my state. So you're going to take that text. You're going to get the embedding for the text. So an embedding, right, is just a vector, which is a numerical representation of a text. And you can get that from like OpenAI or whatever, or from an open source model, what have you. Okay, so that gives us our vector. Now the text has been turned into a vector, but that vector is not interpretable. Then we're going to feed that vector through a neural net, and the neural net is going to have a hidden layer which is sparse. By sparse, what I mean is that in that hidden layer, all activations except the top K activations are going to be set to 0. And empirically, what has been shown is that sparsity encourages the neurons of those hidden layers to correspond to interpretable concepts. I'll give some intuition for why that is in a sec. And then finally, you know, from that sparse hidden layer, the neuron is going to attempt to reconstruct the original text input. And the neural net is going to be basically trained to try and reconstruct the input as accurately as possible from that sparse hidden layer, right? So if you're familiar with autoencoders, what does an autoencoder do? It takes some input, it feeds it through an inner layer, and then tries to reconstruct the original input. That's the autoencoder component. The sparse part is that that inner layer has to be. Okay, so that's what a sparse autoencoder is. Any questions about that basic setup? Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can, basically you can think of that inner layer as learning a latent space, but the sparsity constraint is encouraging the dimensions of that latent space to be interpretable.
Normal autoencoders usually have that much smaller dimension latent space the outputs.
Yeah.
In your case, we just make it really sparse and then they have higher dimension.
Perfect. Yes, very astute question. Yes. So there's two relevant hyperparameters here. There's M and there's K. M is how big is the hidden layer, and then K is how many neurons are allowed to be active. And in general, you can make M much bigger than the original dimension of the embedding if you want, but K is small. And the basic intuition here is like, look, there's like a bajillion concepts that humans could be expressing in any given sentence, but they're probably only expressing a couple of them at a time. They're like simple creatures, we don't express them. So like K is small, M is big. And then the other general pattern is you find as you increase M and K, you need more data to learn it, and also the concepts tend to get more granular. Okay. So yeah, so again, why do sparse autoencoders seem to learn interpretable features? The sort of hand-wavy intuition that people give for this is like the architecture is leveraging the fact that natural language is like in any given text, we're only expressing a small fraction of concepts. And so if you sort of constrain your architecture to do that, you might end up learning concepts that sort of, you know, that capture human interpretable concepts.
So I guess that would help with English, right? Because if you were looking at headlines, say, which might cover any number of topics. Yeah. Like, I mean, in particular headline, there's one or two concepts. Yeah. But across all possible headlines, there's a very large number of concepts. Yeah. So I don't see quite how that is included with this.
That's why you have a really big M, right? Like M says, okay, you can learn many, many concepts at once, but any particular headline has small k, so it can
Oh,
only.
the K is chosen for the headline.
Yeah, K is saying how many of those concepts do you allow to be active per headline, right? So for example.
They can switch around for a
Yeah,
different headline.
exactly. Different headlines
They might
activate
benefit.
different. Yeah, exactly. So these like little red dots, they vary per headline. Yes, perfect. Good. Yeah, good question. Other questions?
This as a way of low rank adaptation.
I don't think it's not about fine tuning, in the context of, I've often been familiar with low rank adaptation as like, let's fine tune just like the final layer to predict a particular. I think that's a little bit different because this is not like a supervised learning problem. This is an auto encoding problem. But we are trying to learn in some sense a low rank representation. Yeah. Good question.
So if you allow each headline to have different position, different K position.
Yes.
Then are you gonna do some extra analysis to figure like, I don't know, maybe regression analysis or something like that to try to understand what are the general features of is this
We're going to try and then, well, you'll see in a second, but basically, yes, we're going to try and say, okay, which of these dimensions actually correlate with the outcome we care about? Example. Yeah. Good. Good. Okay. So that's the first step, generating features. Now we're going to try and select features that predict our outcome. So again, our outcome is that the headline get a lot of, just like we write in the headline, and we're going to use lasso to select the most predicted features. Okay, so to kind of go from all the sparse autoencoder neurons that you learned to the subset that actually correlate with the thing you care about. Lasso, by the way, is not essential here. We use it because it's a use algorithm, but there's like a bunch of, you could do this in univariate fashion. You could use other losses as well if you want. And then finally, so at this point, all we have are a bunch of like numbers, right? Like we have neurons, we know what they activate on, but we don't actually have any interpretations of these neurons. So the final step is to actually interpret the neuron. How do we do this? Well, for each neuron, we're going to take some text that highly activate it and some text that don't highly activate it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to prompt an LLM to explain it generally. So here's an example for a particular neuron. We sampled some text that activated a lot, and that would include for this neuron. They want to see a first little dog hiding in the bush. What they found was a big surprise. A second headline is over 20 years ago, a little girl stunned people from around the world with 5 minutes of wow. Okay, so like the common theme of these highly activating neurons is like mentions being surprised or shocked. And so that would be the interpretation that we would attach to these neurons. Does that make sense?
How do you deal with the prime time? There's 2 levels of sparsity and one through the last one, one through the sparsity and then there's there, right? Multiple activations correlate to the same reconstruction laws, multiple combination of codes, neurons, still. So you get to use like what lasso generally can have multiple solutions.
Yeah.
Get the same.
Yeah.
Is this like stable across those multiple solutions, or like do you expect to be diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. What is the best way to answer that question? So it's definitely true that there's some like trivial non-identifiabilities, right? Like you can just like permute the order of neurons in the hidden layer, but I think there are probably other more fundamental unidentifiabilities. I don't know if we've tried running this on different, one thing you could do, for example, is like run this on different subsets of the, there are various ways you could get at this, right? You could do multiple training runs on the same data and see if it converges to the exact same solution. You could do multiple training runs on data sampled IID from the same distribution and see if it converges to the same distribution. I don't know if we've done those specific stability assessments, although it's a good question and I can ask Raj, but the thing that we do to sort of validate that this is robust is, you get your hypotheses, then you take held out data and you just annotate it using the text. You don't do anything about the SAE at all. And you say, okay, on a held out sample of text, when I just annotate using these hypotheses, do I see sort of statistically significant coefficients? And so in that sense, like these are things, they're robust on held out data in a way that has nothing to do with the SAE, right? So another way of putting this is like, after you generate these hypotheses, you could in theory just throw the SAE away, right? And just be like, okay, does this annotation replicate on held out data? And we see that it does.
So when you're sampling text interpretation, there must be some number of like neurons that you're kind of looking at or concepts, right? Maybe there's 100 or 1,000 or whatever. Do you just loop through like those and then run the examples through an LLM to get your interpretation, and then you have 1,000 like interpretations, and then like as a human choose like, oh, these are good hypotheses, or how do you think about that workflow?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we interpret each neuron separately, and we only interpret the neurons that are correlated with the outcome. I mean, you could interpret all neurons, right? We only interpret the neurons that are correlated with the outcome. In terms of assessing, is this a good hypothesis? There are a couple ways you can assess that. So some of them I think are, here, I'll give you two quantitative ones, and then I'll say I think it's important to also do this qualitatively. So a quantitative thing you can do is you can just, as mentioned, you can just take that hypothesis and see, does it correlate on held out data? That's one. A second thing you can do is, does the annotation correlate with the original neuron activation, sort of a measure of fidelity to the original neuron activation. Like, does your activation seem to capture what the neuron was trying to capture? And so those are two quantitative things you can do. The other thing you can just do, and I think this is worth doing, is just like, if you look at the examples sampled for each neuron, do you as a human feel like they're a good explanation? And I think that's worth doing.
Because this reminds me of the topic modeling, and then after you do the topic model, you get topics from the 10 or whatever, and then you kind of
you're like, oh yeah, this is the vibes of that. Yeah, what I would say is like, I would think of this as topic modeling in the sense that like it serves a similar function, but it works better, basically. Yeah. Good. Like you could run this without any human intervention. I don't think that would be a good idea, but it like works reasonably well.
I'm just wondering about like the granularity of your variable.
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes like the LM output or LM like meaning will give you like very granular sub variable of like a big variable.
Yeah.
I was wondering like how you're deriving like a more like commiserable like concept or like a more like bigger what it call like a variable instead of a sub variable.
Yes, great question. So you can, as I mentioned, in general, as you increase M and K, you're going to get more granular concepts, right? And so the granularity of M and K, I think, tends to be implied by like it's constrained by a couple things. One is like how much data do you have to learn things at all? Another way you can select this is just based on validation performance, like what point does validation performance tail off? And then I think a third thing though is just sort of like, are you getting hypotheses that are interesting? Like, I do think intrinsic to this is a bit of a human in the loop qualitative aspect, because ultimately this is a tool for generating interesting things. And so it's not just about predictive performance. So I think that's part of it too. The final thing I'd say is in recent work, there's something proposed called a Matryoshka SAE. Matryoshka, I didn't know this. Probably everyone else knows this. It refers to like nesting dolls, like the dolls that go inside each other. And so, what Matryoshka SAEs allow you to do is learn features at a range of granularities. And so that can sort of, allow you to like avoid having to choose what granularity you want. And Raj actually recently added that to the package. And, I think it's a useful thing to play around with. Yeah, good questions. Okay. I'm trying to think. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to tell you about this example, which is I actually looked up this first example about the hurt little dog in the bush because I wanted to know what happened to it. And they never tell you in the article. Oh my gosh. Pure clickbait. Just awful. Anyway, it's fine. Okay, but for those not interested in neural network architectures, this is fascinating. This renders is green on the screen, but on my screen it's red. But then on
This projector.
This is great. Okay,
this one's okay.
am I losing my mind? Oh my goodness. Okay, anyway, okay, fine. The point is that here's an example of the features we've learned, because I think it's like useful to sort of understand what is this method actually giving you for those like less interested in the nuances of neural net architecture. So at the top, I'm showing you features that sort of are method identified that correlate with more clicks. And on the bottom, features that are method identifies that correlate with fewer clicks. And for folks on that screen, I'm sorry, you can't see, but it's the bottom 5 ones, which are negatively correlated. So like, for example, if you mention actions or initiatives that positively impact the community, people don't want to click on your headline. If you mention the environment, less likely to click on your headline. If you address collective human responsibility, people are less likely to click on your headline. So this is like somewhat depressing, but like it's easy to see why this might be a useful thing to be able to generate. Okay. How do we know? Wait, sorry, when do we have until 2:45?
10 minutes.
Oh my gosh, okay, let me show you the rest of this quite quickly then. You guys, you're very fun audience, yeah, off the platform, but I do want to show you all this, so let me just show you it, okay. We compare to a bunch of baselines. Some of these baselines are more expensive than our method. We spend more money on them to ensure our comparison is fair. We compare on both synthetic data and real data. And we find that on synthetic data, we generally outperform all baselines. In particular, basically what we're doing in this comparison is we're saying, let's generate data sets with known hypotheses. Can the methods recover the known hypotheses? And we see that, looking at 3 different data sets, 3 different metrics, we outperform all baselines on 8 of 9 pairs. Okay, but synthetic data, how convincing is that? We also look at real data sets. What features of a headline predict engagement? What features of a restaurant review predict rating? What features of a congressional speech predict party affiliation? We assess both predictive performance and the number of hypotheses we get. We find that we both get generally better predictive performance, but also we get way more generated hypotheses, like 45 out of 60 are significant compared to 24 for the next best baseline. The hypotheses are also sort of qualitatively more interesting, but those are the quantitative metrics. And then finally, what you really care about is when you discover new signals in data sets, which past work has studied a lot. And so we look at this, we take a classic study of bigrams and trigrams in Congress. So what these folks were trying to do is sort of say what bigrams and trigrams predict that you're a Republican or a Democrat. We find that even when you control for their previously discovered stuff, this is sort of a seminal study, very widely cited, they get an AUC of 0.61 for predicting party affiliations in the top n grams. We boost that AUC by quite a lot, 0.74. Further, all our hypotheses remain significant. I think more impressive, though, here are sort of the qualitative results. With the bigram method, so again, these are looking for sort of 2-word phrases to correlate with you being a Republican or Democrat. A bigram can give you something like oil companies, which you need domain knowledge to interpret, which maybe is okay if you're looking at congressional speeches, but if you're looking at stuff like medical notes or something, it's much trickier. In contrast, we get stuff our method gives you a specific hypothesis, criticizes oil companies or oil industry practices. Okay, we do another study, see similar results. This was someone's job market paper, I think, and sort of finding we're able to identify hypotheses, even in this very careful study that had not been previously examined. Okay, so to summarize, this is a general method for identifying hypotheses, namely text features that predict a target variable. It outperforms baselines, it's cheaper and more scalable, it discovers new hypotheses even in well-studied data sets. Importantly, yes.
Can you go back one slide?
Yes.
So I think about hypothesis as a worthy question to test, so to speak. And so identifying text features in some ways like a data science task that that's a result in some way. And you find a result that then opens up a question. But I guess I'm curious how you score the hypotheses. So it's because basically once we have a hypothesis and we think it's good, we're going to want to test it out. And then obviously we know kind of if it was good or not after we test it out, if it gave us an insight. But before we test it out, how do you think about the scoring of these hypotheses?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think one is just on a held out data set, when you annotate text with this data set, does it correlate on that held out data set with the outcome? And you could do further follow-up analyses on this. You could experimentally manipulate the input in some way. The great thing to do would be take a headline, manipulate it, see if it gets more clicks or something like that. And that's certainly a follow-up thing you could do. But I do agree with the point that in some sense, hypotheses feels a little weak for what you're actually trying to generate findings here. I think the point of saying hypotheses though, is that you want a human to drill down on does this make sense in light of domain expertise? If we manipulate it causally, does it seem to do the thing that you would expect it to do, stuff like this. Good. Okay, there's code online. The code is easy to use. I have used it myself and I did not write the code, so I can verify that it is easy to use. We're looking for active, exciting places to apply this. I know a lot of folks here work on deepfakes, for example, and can we learn interpretable things that differentiate deepfakes from real data, stuff like this. But anyway, all this is online. Please reach out if you have ideas for collaborations. We're trying to get this into the hands of social scientists. Okay, I'm going to very quickly tell you about this final piece of work, using address data to infer fine-grained migration patterns. This is joint work with a bunch of great co-authors, but in particular led by Gabriel Agostini, who is a PhD student, did a terrific job on this. Okay, so migration, by which I mean how many people move from one geographic area to another. really matters. It's used to study like a whole bunch of different things, you know, responses to environmental disasters, responses to economic stresses, social change, people moving in response to the pandemic, etc. But migration data in the United States is pretty limited. Publicly available data tracks migration only from county to county. And the problem is that many phenomena we care about are much more fine-grained. You know, if you're looking at like how people move in response to flood risk, you want much more granular data because flood risk varies at much more than the county level, or much finer than the county level. Half of moves within the United States are within county, so you're going to miss that entirely. It really limits your study of inequality. You know, if there's inequality, you know, rich areas of the county, poor areas of the county, whatever. So it really limits the study of these important phenomena. Another source of data are proprietary data sets. So these are really, really granular. Here's like an example of what these data sets contain. They're just long lists of addresses, names, and then dates where that person lived at this address. This is an example of what it might look like for me, although these are my work addresses. And so, you know, they're really granular. They are widely used, including for high impact social science research, but they've got significant drawbacks. They're not publicly available. They require a lot of time and resources to process. And fundamentally, they're just sort of like sketchy data sets. Like they're like come from these third-party data aggregators. They won't really tell you where the data come from. You know, it's just unknown noise, biases, etc. So what we do is we create Migrate, a migration data set that reconciles this sort of biased but fine-grained address data with more reliable but less granular census constraints. So we're going to try and get the reliability of census data combined with the granularity of proprietary data. And the output is, you know, annual estimates of flows between 47 billion pairs of census block groups. This is thousands of times more granular than existing 5-year county level data, millions of times more granular than existing state level data. And we have put it on the internet. How do we do this? Using raping, basically, if you're familiar with this algorithm, also known as iterative proportional fitting, claimed by various literatures, including, you know, demography, statistics, and machine learning. Not trying to start any turf wars here, but the basic idea is that we take this raw proprietary data and we iteratively rescale it to match multiple census data sources. A lot of details here I'm not going to go into. I will simply say that Gabriel has a deeper love for and knowledge of census data than anyone else I've ever met and did an excellent job with this. Okay. Here's what we get on a national level, showing sort of out-migration rates. But to get a sense of sort of how we contribute to granularity, it helps to zoom in to New York City. This is what was available before in the top left plot, and this is what is available now. You can see that it's much more granular. Anyone can make pretty pictures. Does this have any correspondence to reality? So we look at sort of how well our data correlates with external census data sources, including census data sources that were not used to produce our estimates. We find that correlations are high. We find that we reduce error relative to the raw proprietary data. We also reduce bias because those errors in the raw proprietary data are not randomly distributed. They sort of show geographic and also demographic skews, both of which we reduce. And then finally, we show that you can actually do useful things with this data set. One thing we do is we use it to study outmigration in response to California wildfires. We take the 2 largest wildfires during the period that we study. And we show that our data kind of clearly reveals dramatic spikes in outmigration. So what I'm showing you in these maps is sort of the wildfire boundary in that dotted red line. And you can see sort of our data shaded showing the outmigration rates. And you can see dramatic outmigration rates in response to the wildfires. And this line graph at top shows that we sort of, you know, show these clear spikes in outmigration, which are visible in our data. In contrast, if you look at the county level census data, these trends remain largely invisible. And that's because the county level data is neither temporally nor spatially granular enough to look at this. Like fires don't cover the whole county and outmigration patterns don't take 5 years. So to summarize, we've released a new data set, which is thousands of times more granular than public data, well correlated with external ground truth data, less biased than proprietary data. You know, we put this on the internet like a few weeks ago or a few months ago. It's being used by teams all over the world, not just in research, but also in journalism, and if you're interested in this area, please download it, shoot us a line, let us know how it works for you. Okay, sorry for the very quick last part, but we did finish on time. Yeah, it's happy to take any other questions.
So is the migration just for out migration, or is it both like to and from, like?
It's to and from, yeah,
So we know like where the fire victims are, you know, what, for this kind of thing.
exactly, yeah. That's why it's 47.4 billion, right? That's like number of CBGs squared.
Awesome.
Well,
Wonderful.
right.